racism, misogyny, xenophobia, homophobia, and all my toxic past coming back to haunt me. No, it isn't cancel culture yet. I actually have an episode coming up about that. I'm just overthinking everything and deconstructing this culture of cultism that I grew up around that led me down some very dark paths of privilege toxicity. I've been breaking down what led me to the Republican Party and what led me out of American republicanism. But this isn't all about party politics. I actually answered a lot of that in part 1. Part 2 was really mostly about racism and xenophobia. The last episode covered a lot of misogyny and more racism. I need to get to the origin of idea. What made me think the things that led me to being a Republican? I'm talking, of course, about toxic white Southern culture, which is rooted in the narcissistic, all about me and disregard everyone elseism, as well as the sociopathic disconnect of human emotion, empathy, compassion, the disassociation from humanity. In this final episode of the Politics of Dancing series, there's no dancing around my own toxicities. I'm spilling my own blood on the dance floor on this one, and 1, 2, 3ing a waltz of wokeism as I break down the toxic masculinity of bully culture and how this poor little kid who didn't fit in anywhere and was bullied his whole life became the bully, and why my culture encourages that. And welcome to the podcast. Don't turn away, or I'll beat you up. As I spoke about in the previous episode, for me, college was a catalyst of transformation. But even that was seedlings of thought and slow change. Everything before college really cemented this broken boy into the man that would graduate high school and head out into this world to traumatize others with my unresolved trauma. The issue is, everything before college was it just wasn't rich in deep philosophical intellectual thought or diversity in the human experience, let's say. My dad and I moved from that sundown town I told you about in part 1. We went straight to Nashville, which is way more diverse than Music Row or the country music charts. I didn't adjust well at first. Then I met my best friend and his little brother who lived 2 doors down. They were black. This was a big deal for me. I'd like to say it was because we clicked and were close in age. I'm sure that's part of it. But it's really that I was the new kid who lived on the front of the block, so did they, and all the white kids in the neighborhood picked on me. I'm sure, had the white bullies accepted me, I'd have flocked to my comfort zone and been just as horrible. Still, DeJuan and Charles and I were pals. I was grateful for their presence. I didn't have many friends back then. We used to hang out in their basement. Not in my yard, mind you. Especially not in the backyard. That's why my racist dog Scooter was tied up. We got Scooter back in the sundown town. He was real friendly with me, protective. But he would lose his mind anytime he saw a person of color. See? Even my dog from that town was problematic. Come to think of it, DeJuan never really came in my house much at all. I only went upstairs at his place a few times, and that was just briefly. But I can't remember him coming into my house. And I don't think I need to spend too much time wondering why. Maybe by the end of this season, I'll unlock the memory in my head of my dad saying, "Don't you let that boy in my house." I don't really remember being racist, but I do remember whenever DeJuan and I would fight or argue, which wasn't often, but when it escalated to name-calling, I went for the cultural jugular. Just like I was trained to. It's not that I went to parades or rallies or even voted Republican yet. I was too young to vote. I just had a lot of toxic ideals about everything. I remember several times having that word attempted to be beaten out of me as a young man. You'd think I'd have learned after the first few times. It's what I'm saying. You can't be too smart if you're using that word. Dewan and we didn't go to the same school, and I think that's an important detail because I believe if we were friends in a more social setting around others, things might have been different. How, I don't know. I just know that this was an example of how I partially knew my black friend. When I speak of those superficial relationships, I mean those where you know them but you don't know that person, and you don't make any effort to fill in those gaps. It's also important to note that even though I moved from Podunk, Tennessee to the big city of Nashville, we moved to a different part of town than the one my mom lived in. And we used mom's address so I could go to a better school, you know? By the end of 6th grade, Dad was over the commute across town. Nashville traffic, who could blame him? So I went to the school I was zoned for. Wasn't a great school. And the diversity at the school I went to before versus this new school was different diversity. Let's just say I had moved from Hee Haw to My Name is Earl and then went from Wayne Brady to Biggie Smalls with the schools I went to. And with all due respect, it's that my toxicity and racism was comfortable around a controlled environment, one that didn't frighten or heighten my senses. My first school in Nashville wasn't free from bullying, but it was more docile, structured, and very disciplined. It wasn't so much the kids, I think, as it was the educational environment. Still, what I remember of Glencliff Elementary in that time was not really fitting in, but also not getting my ass kicked every day. Normal sociopathic kid bullying. Moving to the new school, the halls, the cafeteria were loud. The principal was kind of racist, which worked out for me. Wait, I shouldn't say that. I have no idea if the man was racist. What I know is that I was picked on and bullied, and I didn't get in trouble for the altercations as much as the black kids who were picking on me. In fact, I got in one little fight, and the kid twice my size never came back to school. I didn't think about it much at the time, to be honest. I was glad to be rid of him. I was probably his last strike. It'd be decades before I would learn of the systematic issues faced with our respective cultures that sort of breed this dynamic. Toxic bullying, bad behavior, getting in trouble, thrown out of school. These aren't racial issues. I know white kids with similar tales. But sadly, this systematic oppression is the thing that unites us. Tell that to the 6-foot-tall, 200-plus-pound black kid punching a 5'5", 7th grade scrawny white boy who has to stand on a chair just to look his bully in the eye. And what started it? The kid was a bully all through science class. I don't remember. I doubt I said anything to instigate it. In fact, I probably held my tongue for a long time, which was my style. Take it until it blows over. I don't like to fight because I don't believe in fighting fair. I believe if you're going to lower yourself to fight, you have the right to end. It's your victim's duty to ensure you learn that lesson permanently, one way or the other, so that you never cross that line again. I know that sounds brutal, but watch who you swing at. Now, I'm not saying I advocate for that level of insanity. I am saying that if you go savage and violent, whatever comes to you, you brought on yourself. We all lose our cool. Violence toward another person just isn't cool, right? He was a junior in high school who couldn't get out of 7th grade. This kid was huge, big football factor, and he still couldn't pass. In the 80s, in the South. Hell, maybe that's why they held him back. Dude was the offensive line. I have no idea. I don't even know the kid. I just know that when he hit me, I didn't fall from that chair. He had a close crop haircut, so I took my lessons from the WWF. I grabbed his ears, I jumped off the chair, and I slammed his face into one of those really big, thick science class desks, you know, with the faucet and the gas hookups. You know, that was the commotion. The teacher needed to come back in and do her job. I got my ass kicked, but I got a good lick in or two, which was all I could ask for someone much bigger than me. I was ready for that kid. My dad trained me well. Fighting that kid was much like sparring with my dad. The size and ferocity. Dad's love, his tough love, it did manage to teach me something. It wasn't just race, though. For whatever reason, as a kid, call it my energy or my vibe, but sociopathic kids just didn't like me. Didn't matter what specific group they belonged to or how they identified, those kids who are the bullies by nature, you know who they are, usually raised by sociopaths. Surprised I didn't fit in. I was already sort of a little smart-ass prick when I did talk, and when I did talk, it didn't go well, so I tried not to talk. And then I didn't talk and I got made fun of until I talked, and then I usually said something funnier than the bully, and that never ends well for someone who doesn't enjoy fighting back. I hated it there. I hated it everywhere. I sunk into a deeper depression, a vibe my fellow classmates probably fed off of even more. The first time I attempted my own life, that's hard to say. I did a whole song about my various failed attempts to leave this world called I Killed Myself. Again, this whole show is an infomercial for therapy. The only thing worse than not fitting in was knowing that nothing I did was ever going to change that. Moving for me was an opportunity for reinvention. It didn't matter who I tried to be, though. Who I was just wasn't good enough for people. By the time I got to really settle into the atmosphere in Nashville, we moved right back to another podunk, racist town a half hour from the first racist sundown town. This time to my dad's hometown, the place he grew up, because that worked out so well for him. Note, we only moved to the big city when Dad was desperate for work, and so I could be closer to my mom, too. There was no intent to make that our home. I realize that now. Dad was always going to gravitate to what he was comfortable. His hometown, just like so many do. This was where I would graduate high school, form the friendships that should last a lifetime, and grow into the man I'd be before setting off into the world to traumatize others with my own unresolved traumas. Pre-high school was moving around 4 or 5 times, 3 towns, 4 schools, and 3 grades. Always a new kid. I was either ignored or bullied. High school was more stable, but it still wasn't fun. I was bullied a lot. That's what this episode is about. The bully culture that permeates this toxic, white, Southern culture I'm deconstructing. In America, we are trained to bully, indoctrinated into it. When it came to race, I was a mixed bag of nuts. I didn't want trouble, but trouble often found me. Likely from those self-fulfilling prophecy situations I mentioned in previous episodes. I had this bully who sat next to me in English most of high school. He was relentless. I guess from that I can say that while I didn't think of myself as racist, since I wasn't one of the poor, trashy kids waving the Confederate flag around whining that the South would rise again, I also didn't care to hurl an insult, even if it was an epithet, even if it was a wish for one of the worst fates a racist white kid could wish on his African-American bully. You see this a lot with white or privileged communities who present themselves as allies to the marginalized communities. White tears is when someone like me is trying to be open and understanding and represents themselves as openly anti-whatever bigotry, but let's go with racism. Except that they say something daft. They get challenged, and then their old indoctrinations rear its ugly head, and it's jarring for everyone involved, and often more accurately, devolved. A brief psychological break in one's well-maintained facade of tolerance and progress, or the exposure of performative histrionics. It's a case-by-case basis in this cancel culture era of political correctness, or of personal correction, however you decide to see this transition phase of social acceptability and tolerance. In a few episodes, I'll discuss that much more. My father's racism offended me. He told jokes, yeah, but his ideas of so many people, just for superficial identifying traits, were so generalized, hurtful, insensitive, and justified for all the wrong reasons. When I look back, my father was a resourceful man. He was a knowledgeable man about many things. He presented as somewhat learned, maybe not educated, but I realized after I graduated that his college was more like a reform school where he finished high school. My father was no more accredited to teach than he was to practice medicine. He wasn't a credentialed architect, but hey, Dad could design a building from dirt. My dad could do anything. But was my father a smart man? I don't think I come from smart people, especially on my father's side. My mother and her family, well, my Nana, my mom, her brother anyway, they always seemed more accepting of others. Certainly, my sister escaped a lot of that toxicity, which I think is rooted in the patriarchy. Now, when it comes to my patriarchy, I can't say they were critical thinkers, philosophers, big picture people. Maybe that's my lingering toxicity, is how I look down on simple-minded people. Simple people I love. Simple-minded people I just can't stand. What I know is that even though I looked at my father as unevolved and unenlightened, I couldn't resist the urge to plunge into my own toxicity, justified that my attitudes were valid because I wasn't hateful or whatever. I was at least learned and experienced in my ideas. In fact, all I had managed was to climb just a rung or two higher on the racist ladder than my father. Evolution is a slow process. I'd criticize my father for his out and open bigotry, whether he was joking or sincere. We fought over that a lot. Many "get out of my house if you think I'm" screaming matches. I wanted to believe my father was good. We all do. I was tormented and pushed to my limits, never feeling safe sitting in that English class in high school, a subject I would go on to be certified to teach as an adult. I'd be minding my own business and have just bitten off fingernails spat in my direction, for example, pencil shavings blown at me, spitballs, you name it. He'd whisper to me randomly in the middle of class, "Hey, penis!" That was his nickname for me, penis. He wasn't even creative, which bothered me more than being bullied. I was bullied by an intellectual amoeba. I guess maybe I'd have appreciated a challenge. But the bullies I always got were physically slightly more imposing, but more unmatched in intellect and wit. It seemed my father was right all along. I had $1 million mouth and a $5 ass. Granted, I had no idea that a family member of his was terrorized and murdered in the same manner I threatened him if he didn't leave me alone. But I still should have never said what I said. And I can't blame him for jumping on me. Honestly, I don't know what he could have done that would have warranted what I said. What I said was disgusting, deplorable, and unimaginable. I was over it. I snapped. We talk about these dangerous kids who do terrible things to other kids in school. Well, this was a moment where these events take root. Tracing back the origins of many school shooters, I'm certain events and interactions like the ones I'm describing are present in their psychological profiles. My dad had lots of guns and didn't have them locked up. I definitely wanted this kid gone. And my rationale at the time wasn't fully formed. What stopped me from doing that? I can't tell you. I've thought about it my whole life. I had all the markers. I checked all the boxes. What stopped me from being a headline? My desire to get out of that god-awful podunk nothing town and get away from those god-awful podunk nothing people? As horrible as that sounds, I wasn't going to give up my future for these lowlifes. I was better. I would be better. I'd show them. Oh, I'd show them. That's all I can think about. Other than my drive to rise above my father's shitty existence, I have no reason why my mindset at the time didn't make an example out of someone. I was a pacifist at the core. I didn't like violence or drama. I had enough of that at home. I needed peace. I've always sought out peace. So if my father's racism, bigotry, and jokes bothered me so much, what made me stoop to the lowest form of verbal racism against one of my classmates, even if this kid was a terrorist? This bully had accused me of racism before, and it bothered me at the time and since. "You don't like me because I'm black," he shouted, sitting right in the next row. I corrected him. In fact, that he was black had nothing to do with it. He was just an asshole. He just happened to be a black asshole. And truth be told, I only didn't like him because he terrorized me. This wasn't a self-fulfilled prophecy. This was targeted bullying. He had a choice every day to leave me alone. I had a choice too. I could have risen above and held to some values. But instead, after he already repeatedly accused me of racism when I wasn't being racist, from my perspective, of course, when he came at me with some bullshit and I'd hit my limit and enough was enough, I showed my true colors, folks. I went right for the jugular, and I sought to hurt him with my words the same way he hurt me with, well, his fucking everything about him. And I can see my father like the ghost of Emperor Palpatine, full mutated Sith Lord mode, force lightning swarming around his body. Yes, haha, say it, feel the white side. I suppose to a bystander, it's difficult to see that I didn't mean they were all these terrible things. I didn't wish this horribly offensive fate on all of them, just this one dipshit football player who happened to be what they are. Yeah. I don't think they finished the thought. That's the critical thinking. Anyone can have a thought. It takes critical thinking to finish that thought and prove it and justify it. The follow-through of the thought to the end, pragmatically predicting potential possibilities to prepare people's perspectives. I adore alliteration a lot, almost as much as a magnificent metaphor. Here's where finishing that thought, the critical thinking, really brings it home to empathy. The thing I didn't realize at the time as well was that someone hearing me say something like that to one person who looks like them and doesn't look like me doesn't resonate that I'm saying it to this one person who did me wrong. It's how long before he says that about me. Because I said it, so I clearly mean it. At very least, it's present in my spirit. We don't always consider it that deeply when we're faced with the consequences for our words, in anger, in humor, in jest, in earnest. It's in our heads at all. It's there, present in us. How could anyone trust me? Of any group, my own or otherwise. I revealed my true character. It didn't matter that I felt backed into a corner with no other defense other than this atomic bomb. Perfect metaphor. Because once you do that, you can't go back. You're the person who stooped that low, and it doesn't matter if you get away with it because of where and when you did it. You did it. I did it. Now, in a different world, one that truly valued children, we would have had counseling, I would have had counseling, he would have had counseling, things would have been done to ensure that he wasn't a toxic asshole, graduating into the world to be a toxic asshole to everyone in his path, making lots of people's lives worse, and things would have been done to ensure I wasn't a traumatized asshole who internalized his abuse and then had no positive or productive role model for processing that kind of trauma. So I simply just deflected that hurt onto someone else and became a bully to my friends, which I'll lay out in a moment. Yeah, I was toxic and problematic, even though I was trying not to be, and thought I was above that level of racism because I wasn't as bad as the lowest of the low in my community. That was a low bar to be above, folks. I was shooting from the stars, just through the steely sewer grates of the gutter. Perspective matters. Maybe it's that I didn't know many people of color, or I didn't try as hard to know them. And I may not have been the person someone in another group felt comfortable knowing. I've mentioned before in this show, my childhood was at times volatile and unstable. I couldn't escape the teasing or abuse. Authority figures, my dad, teachers, people at school, church, a lot of my life, and how I would see the world, I've discovered, was built on bullying. This would come to form some of my most toxic ideals and be the foundation of my earliest socio-political ideals. Middle school was changing schools a lot and never really finding close friends. I became sort of self-dependent in that regard. I was lonely, but what did I know of loneliness, right? I was a kid. From the point my parents split around 4th grade to starting my freshman year of high school, I changed schools 7 times and lived in 5 different places, I think. You'd think my dad's promise to not move anymore and let me finish high school at one school, well, it was just sort of hollow when the place he chose to do that was, well, this vacuum of opportunity. High school sucked for me. I didn't fit in. I didn't like the dirty old school. It was the same school my dad went to. People knew my dad, my family, and by extension, these small-minded simpletons thought they knew me. It was just old and small. The school, the town, the mindset, small. The people just, everybody knew each other. They had for their whole lives. Except me. I came in as a freshman, the new kid. I could make up my own story. Or they could. I'd assembled this ragtag group of misfits, those of us who didn't fit in with the athletes or the academes. We were just kind of there. Some of us were good students, some of us were class clowns, but we were all united in not really fitting in. The few guys who did play sports played like tennis. Needless to say, we weren't running and hiding from bullies constantly, but, well, we sure weren't winning homecoming king either, you know? We sort of became bullies to our own, right? There came to be a pecking order, a hierarchy among my friend group. Being one of the oldest and quickest of wit, I was seated sort of at the head of the table. My house was one of the main gathering spots. I drove us to most of our adventures. I suppose a boy with a more emotionally stable raising might have taken that leadership role and done something productive with it. I, on the other hand, mocked some of them relentlessly. Part of this is boys being boys, which I don't care for at all. However, there's something to be said about this culture of guys giving each other shit. This is a culture of toxic testosterone taunting. Sounds fun, but someone is the victim. Someone is the center of ridicule, whether it's all in good fun or not. We justified our sociopathic disconnect from our empathy and compassion with some boys' club fraternity trauma bonding gaslighting bullshit. It was a rite of passage. If you get roasted, you've made it. Here's what I've learned far, far, far too late in life. Bullying is bullying, and it's harmful and traumatic. Context doesn't matter when you're being violated like that. It's very much like any other form of abuse, but I will liken it to the trauma of an intimate or sexual assault. Bullying violates your very security and safety in very similar ways. I'm not saying they're the same, by any means. Very different. But the effects internally, emotionally, mentally are similar to sexual assault. And I use that as a comparative example because it's so jarring. But we have to start seeing these things on the same level. Bullying is abuse. Bullying is assault. We had one friend, good guy, sweet-natured. Look, if there was a kid who wanted to fit in more than I did, it was this kid. And I think we all took advantage of that. It's this weird dynamic of the bully cycle. For years, I was victimized by bullies as the new kid, as the wise ass. Whatever the reason or excuse was, I didn't fit in, and lots of kids made it their mission to remind me of that daily. Still, when I managed to have a little bit of influence, what did I do? I aimed my razor-sharp wit at my friends. After all, it's not bullying if you're friends, right? Our friends know we don't mean it, right? Except that I didn't aim it at my friends. I aimed it at the most likely victim, the easiest. I found the weakling and I stalked my prey. Maybe I wasn't thinking like that at the time, but it sure seems like that way in hindsight. After all, we pick our patsies well, don't we? People in the group didn't come after me all that often because, again, I was oldest and quickest of wit. We found our weakest link. After an incident that crossed a line even for guys being guys, my dad asked me why we picked on him. My answer was, "He's pathetic, Dad." Without getting too much into stuff that I really don't care to relive, my sentiment was that I needed to toughen the kid up. He was too soft. I can pinpoint dozens of pop culture references that reinforce the idea, but it really just stems from this pull yourself up by your bootstraps tough love mentality. I cared about my friend. He was like a little brother. We could pick on him. You better not. In my own way, I think part of me felt like I was preparing him for the real world, except I was bullying the kid every day. It was jokes and remarks. He was the primary source of our ridicule. He was an easy target, and he took it well. We never saw him cry. Though I can still see the sad loneliness in his eyes, knowing his closest friends didn't even value him as a person. These were his friends, and this was his high school experience he'd waited for in his town. He was picked on enough in middle school, one of those kids with a nickname people found inappropriate alternative meanings for. Now he'd hoped to turn a new corner, right? Except now the new kid comes along and not only steals the spotlight, but also all the friends. I really am assuming a lot here, but I can tell you this kid didn't deserve any of that. He at least deserved to go to school and learn in peace. We denied him that. I denied him that for laughs. I did it for the laughs. I liked that guy a lot. He was a good friend to me, a better friend to me than I was to him. He wasn't perfect, but I did little to help, and probably a great deal to hinder his personal and emotional development in those crucial years. Now, I'm not sure if anyone from those days reflects on our time together the same way. I don't like who I was. I don't like that the only way I could escape the ridicule was to turn it on someone else. I'm disappointed in myself for not being smart enough to figure out another way. One of those moral dilemmas that I've spoken about before, I sold my soul. I made my choice. I wanted to be accepted, even if it meant by excluding him. I know that's easy to say that now, but overthinking everything is important to preventing making the same mistakes in the future. I can blame society, the environment, peer pressure, the media I consumed, whatever. But ultimately, I made the decision every day to put that kid up on a pike in front of the castle for all the plebes to hurl apples at. I don't know, that made sense in my head at the time. It worked. My point is, I became the bully, and I was still being bullied by other kids too. It's a toxic and nonsensical social food chain, this horrendous high school hierarchy of hypocrisy and humiliation for humor. I was never cut out for bullying. I was, at my core, a pacifist, a term I learned from G.I. Joe. One of the team's medics, Lifeline, refused to carry a sidearm because he felt it violated his principles of being a saver of lives. He's supposed to heal, not hurt. In fact, one time he fell into water with piranhas, and when one of his teammates extended his rifle so he could grab hold and pull himself out, Lifeline hesitated because he wouldn't touch a gun. I'm not sure I'd been exposed to that level of principle outside of a religious fairy tale or Aesop's fable before. Plus, a complete alternative perspective from the one my father raised me with. You want to talk about some weird philosophy that transformed me? Lifeline from G.I. Joe. I know that sounds trite, but it truly clicked for me more than anything my dad taught me with a gun in my hands. I like peace, but controlled chaos. I was more the schemer and the manipulator than the aggressor and the fighter. See, some guys would just get mad and throw fists. I would seek to learn your secrets and dismantle you slowly over time. I would turn your friends and family against you. I would discredit you, and probably, though I didn't know the term at the time, I would probably gaslight the fuck out of you. I knew what I was early on. It's probably good I got my heart broken early. Shattered. Kept me in check, no doubt. I knew I had a weakness, and I protected that. And in doing so, I shut down a part of my empathy. Feeling anything would be feeling everything. Seeing that? No. I cannot afford to open my eyes. I was really mean to this kid in a way that wasn't on the surface abusive. It wasn't bullying because I liked him. He was just an easy target and didn't get his feelings hurt. Except that I didn't know that he went home and thought about ending his life every day because he felt so hopeless thinking about the next day and what bullshit he'd have to deal with from the only people who accepted him and still didn't value him as a human. Maybe that would be a day he'd get to laugh with us and somebody else would be the target. My mother bought me a video camera to record my stand-up comedy sets. The one time someone believed in my talent as a kid and provided me with the tools to prove my talent, and I let another guy talk me into making a mockumentary about how pathetic our friend was. It didn't take much convincing. He was certainly a bad influence, though. His neo-alpha and my zeta personalities clicked enough that we could coexist, collaborate, and conspire, but his narcissism and two-facedness was well known in the group. It was a given that the second you were out of earshot, this guy was shit-mouthing you. You couldn't trust him or believe him as genuine or authentic. So why did we even let him hang around? Toxic birds of a toxic feather, I guess. Maybe if I wouldn't stand up to him, who would? I don't know. This guy, whom I let push me way over the line, was very sociopathic in his complete and immediate disregard for whomever wasn't in the room. Those were his closest friends, if he had any at all that were real. I'm not blaming him for my narcissism and my sociopathic behavior, but his more extreme narcissism and sociopathic behavior was like the gasoline in the Molotov cocktail. He pushed us farther at times than I probably would have. As leadership rivals, I think whether we knew it or not at the time, we were also trying to outdo each other. That was one of the worst things I've ever done, and we should have been expelled. Hell, criminal charges, suits, something. We should have had all sorts of things happen that didn't. We showed that mockumentary in school. It was humiliating for my friend, my victim. And yet it didn't really occur to me that this was going to be devastating for this child because people were laughing. It was funny. Come on. To almost everyone, sometimes the laughter shouldn't be the gauge for right and wrong. What I learned? That there is an abuse cycle. This obviously is covered in psychology textbooks. It's a thing. I didn't discover this. It's just that this is a different form of abuse. This was a culturally normalized form of abuse I would see in years to come. And culturally normalized abuse I would shell out as well in the future. This was my earliest trauma tied to abuse. The bullying I received from my father, cousins, people I trusted. My brother would bully me, and he was bullied by my dad exponentially worse than I was. I was the youngest. I got off easy. Still, here I was, being that same embodiment of toxicity. You see, evolution is rarely a wake up one day and you're better kind of thing. It's a marathon, not a sprint, right? Slow process, etc. This is why therapy is so vital to survival. Resolved traumas are lessons learned. All I did was regurgitate my unresolved trauma onto him, and there's no telling how that manifested in his life moving forward. Now, I wasn't the only one, but my mistakes are the ones I need to own. I was the leader of that pack. I should have held myself to a higher standard. But mine is a toxic culture of cultism. Good old boys being boys is sort of its own little cult as well. held to different standards, secret safe with us. Which fraternity do you want to join? Oh, let's get you into the Masons or the Elk Lodge. And look, we ain't gonna let this get out, are we? I mean, it sure would be really worse on you if you did tell, you know. Everybody looking at you different. Sorry. Should have said trigger warning, but it was this type of abuse and the selective disconnect from one's empathy, compassion, and humanity that I observed in others. And I've recognized like an aura around them since. It's like this switch was flipped, and I was now aware of a pattern. I've always had a knack for patterns, trends. What I saw in these folks and their ability to just selectively decide when to pretend to be humans and when to be ruthless, self-serving primitives was astonishing. This would be something I would observe and study every step of the way throughout my life from that point forward. Let me say this about my findings in this informal social scientific case study. This goes beyond a crass remark in private company. This is the compromise of character, a hypocrisy of values on a much deeper and larger scale. Once I was aware of that, I couldn't turn the filter off. I could see it in someone within minutes of a conversation. Not only could I identify it, I could draw it out. That's when it hit me. That's what I've been doing all along. Now, I didn't intend to. That's no excuse for my behavior, jokes, words, or otherwise. There is no excuse, just reasons. It's to say that I have subconsciously been studying them and their reactions the whole time. I've realized it wasn't that I enjoyed the groans from being edgy more than I did the laughs in front of an audience. It's that the groans fueled me. So long as I knew some people still found what I was saying atrocious, I felt comfortable about the world I lived in. Clearly, I was the worst person in the world because who would say something like that? A comment I've heard more than a few times over awkward, reflexive laughter. I needed those groans. Those groans told me people knew what I said was wrong, and since I didn't really believe those horrible things, what's the harm, right? Somewhere along the way, I heard fewer and fewer groans, more laughs. But worse, not so much laughs, but echoes of approval. I know that sounds like, well, it almost sounds like I'm sticking a thermometer up society's ass, just checking to make sure we're not running a fever. To tie it into the episodes preceding this series, here's what really pushed my behavior into justification territory. This was where I was able to bypass my humanity to treat someone like less than human. Please, pay very close attention, because this next part is the point. I was the new kid in school. But that also meant I was the new kid in church. While I'd been to my granny's church many times as a child, now I went to Granny's church. I visited a few times a year. Now I lived there. I never really felt like I belonged there, though that's safe to say that church was home base for me spiritually as a vagabond child. My grandmother was the most stable and consistent presence in my life. This was her church. These were her people. And I'm not judging them all. No, by no means. There are some lovely people I know from this time in my life. But I was bullied by many in the youth group. My cousin specifically would tease me with what I now realize were sort of inappropriate comments. I recognize this because I've come to recognize how inappropriate and cringy some of my own comments, jokes, poor humor, behaviors, even if they're unhealthy coping mechanisms, have been, and can be, and may have been perceived as. Let me pause on that comment, okay? As in, I have considered not only what I said, but a myriad of different ways some of those things could have been heard or received by others who experienced it. That's a big step, y'all. It's one of the hardest steps of this process, I think. Like, I'm saying I'm aware of some things I've said where I'm like, wow, you said that, dude? Like today, we would never tease a child about puberty, right? Like, I think making comments about one's developing body, very complicated thing. There's no way that's not going to come across as weird, so why even say it? But back then, 16 Candles, Molly Ringwald got felt up by her grandmother, who was so impressed by her granddaughter's development she had to feel for herself. So much weird shit was normalized for us, even in extreme humor or satire. Young minds cannot discern sarcasm. Did you know that? Subscribe, because I got a whole episode later this season about human development. Oh, the science of it, why it's a building block to answering, why are we the way we are? My cousin would make comments about the hair on my legs or stuff like that, how I was growing or filling out, but it seemed to make me feel weirdly sexualized in a way I wasn't comfortable by someone I wasn't comfortable with saying it. I didn't feel like she was making a move on me, but I was just a kid who kind of grew up with already sort of sexualized ideas about people. Very toxic masculinity and sexual entitlement. I would say culture, but I certainly knew consent, right and wrong, and the idea of that would be appalling. However, there's a lot of mixed messaging in our culture where consent is concerned, and we're just now starting to really embrace a lot of that. But growing up as a kid in the 80s and 90s, cartoons were sexualized, comic books even. Go look at any female hero or villain from the early 80s, early 90s, 70s. Barbarella? Just to say, I didn't feel threatened by my cousin, but I was aware enough to feel kind of weirded out by the comments at the time. Very uncomfortable. Years later, I'd come to realize that she had feelings for my brother, who was my half-brother, not her biological cousin. So it's not that weird for rural Tennessee, right? My brother took her to prom. My brother took my cousin to the prom. I wanted to put that in a single sentence so you could kind of clip that out for social media. Yeah, I know a few things about stereotypes, people. Knowing she had these weird, inappropriate feelings for a family member, and then I was only a few years younger. Then I started growing up, and she starts making comments about my body. Well, it made me very uncomfortable at the time, but then again, like I said, I've been part of a culture where making comments about women's bodies is normalized. So, gooses and ganders, I guess, right? Grab 'em by the pussy happened because this culture of toxicity has been normalized for most of our lives, all of our lives. People just started acting outraged over that tape. We still aren't outraged over those who embrace those ideals and enable men who do. I don't know if I was being groomed or she just had a really shitty personality. The latter I know to be absolutely to have turned out true, but what I know is how it made me feel then and how I reflect on it now. And it leads me into this being bullied by people from my church, including my cousin. I was beaten up at a lock-in by guys who I thought were my friends at school. This was freshman year before I really found my friend group that I told you about before. So, school or church, the drama was the same, the people were the same, and the churchy thing didn't seem to matter to anyone. The adults didn't seem to care. This culture of harassment and bullying was normalized in society, television, movies, music, everywhere. Except on the few anti-bullying posters or PSAs. In America, we're always picking on somebody. My dad would pick on me relentlessly. And look, this is a big part of my sharp, quick wit today. I had to be on my toes around my dad. He'd let one fly. Boy, if you didn't give one back really quick, he'd just keep going. Dad was just a big kid. We were best friends. We got along great most of the time. I don't hate my dad. I loved him and I miss him. I just know that if he were here today, if he were alive, I probably wouldn't talk to him because I think I know where he'd stand. And it's because of that, it's led me to approach this topic from sort of a sociological, scientific, case study perspective. My dad, like many, was a good man, but he also, like many, wasn't. Now, how do I reconcile that? Because the same is true for me, and most all of us. Because none of us can pass the purity tests I've talked about on Overthinking Everything. None of us can pass the purity tests we apply to others. Glass houses of hypocrisy. We all compromise our values and then justify our reasoning. My justification with my poor pal from high school was that my behavior was normalized and accepted by not just my entertainment culture and, well, everything about my culture, but especially by my spiritual community too. The abuse and violations happened to me by people in that spiritual realm, one's most vulnerable place, literally and figuratively. Now, I have more stories I could share that relate to this point of exposing my own toxicity and overthinking it, but I need to make this point because this is the spoiler for the conclusion of this entire first season of the show. The standards that are set by things that are at the foundation of our principles, our religious communities and governing bodies, specifically for this context, set the bar for your individual standards. The lower those standards of the hierarchy, the lower our own standards will go. We don't rise above the flag or God, right? These are holy to Americans. So we're always less humbly perfect than God. That's why those standards, if we're going to allow them, need to be monitored and respected. What someone will do by their own justification isn't nearly as dangerous as what someone will do when their actions are justified by their highest influences. That is called white, religious, extremist nationalism with a Z. I studied history, civics. I learned what fascism was. I became fascinated by the worst men in history and how they amassed such a fervent following. Then I began seeing some of those qualities in my own political ideologies. I began to see fascism unfold, nationalist ideals and propaganda pushed, and I took a step back and said, this isn't who I am or want to be. This isn't who I believe we need to be. To say this in closing, there is one foundational and fundamental building block to fascism, which is the driving force of this culture I'm speaking of. Bullying. Bully culture is what has happened here. We've allowed the bullies to win. The victors wrote the history and left us out of it. And now, the more reasonable and intellectual Zetas are trying to take back the Unga Bunga alpha spot from men who will defend that throne with their literal lives. When I think about the things that led me to the Republican Party, it was the toxicity, the classism, the racism, the xenophobia, the homophobia, the supremacy and superiority, the feeling that I was better than people simply because of superficial lifestyle, religious, physical, or geographical characteristics. Feeling that no one mattered more than me in policy, in perspective, in personality, in person. Feeling like my status would be maintained as a white, straight-presenting, Christian-identifying male. Feeling like I'd be rich and taken care of with no thought or regard for how or at what expense of others. Lots of things. But at the core of all of that is the bully culture of America. In politics, in religion, at home, in school, at the playground, in the checkout line, and any and everywhere, especially in our most trusted and most vulnerable environments, which is one of the biggest factors that make us susceptible to cultism. Bully culture is my culture of cultism. Coming up, we're taking a look at the holidays that give us those valuable days off from work. Those holidays that close the banks and pause the post. In Cracking the Commandment Code, the Cultism of Columbus, I'm asking, who discovered America? And why do we still celebrate the one guy we know for a fact who didn't come close? And when you find out who the most likely first settlers of these old United States of America were, well, no, you probably won't be surprised at all. I'm examining the complicated problematics of Columbus, but also turning that microscope on our other holidays. After all, if the Judeo-Christian commandments are clear on idol worship and putting things before God, then why do we have more days off for flawed men than we do for God? Which offshoot religious cult believes ancient Israelites were the first to settle here? What if I told you once there were actual giants who roamed these lands? Why Martha Washington really freed her husband's slaves? Who was St. Patrick? This is one of my all-time favorite episodes. So catch up on previous episodes of Overthinking Everything as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. Check out my other videos on YouTube. I've got them all separated in playlists for you. You can check out my original music I record under the Sir Talks a Lot moniker, and that's at a playlist. Go like all those videos. Tell me what you think. Follow me on TikTok. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Do all the things I need you to do. And check out my podcast on the other streaming platforms as well. If you want to support me, check out my merch. Subscribe to Patreon or hit me up on Cash App. Thanks for being here. Come back next time. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.